Well, a good day. Here we are back again, going through this book by Bill Crowder called "For This He Came," and talking about the journey that Jesus makes from the Last Supper to the cross and beyond. And today, we're going to be talking about the unjust trials. And in this session, we're going to be talking about the religious trials. There are two different trials that happen. One is the religious trials and the other is the civil trials. So today we're going to touch on the unjust trials, the religious trials. And so this is part 7. And just to recap, just make sure that we're all on the same page here. I just want to touch on what we've talked about already. Okay, we've talked about the Last Supper. We did our cedar plate. We talked about the revelation of Judas being the betrayer of Jesus. We talked about the disciples' arrogant boasting of their loyalty and allegiance, and this happened at the Last Supper and in the garden. No, we'll never leave you. We'll never abandon you. The walk to the Garden of Gethsemane, the singing and rejoicing as they walked, and as per Jewish custom after the Passover, this is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. And that is still a very astounding declaration from Jesus, knowing full well that this is the day that he will be going to the cross, and yet he says, I will rejoice in it. Jesus is alone in the garden praying for the Father to remove the cup, and yet, of course, willing to drink from it. Jesus being confronted by hundreds of Roman soldiers and temple guards, and Jesus being deserted as the disciples scattered, and of course, Jesus being denied by his most trusted disciple, Peter. And this is where we left off last time. And so we're just going to pick right up and we're just going to get right into it today with the religious trials. In between being deserted by all the disciples and being denied by Peter, we now have the arrest. John 18:12-13 says, Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. So the book outlines 6 places where Jesus stands, and this is including the trials, of course. And we really need to understand the political scene of the day in order for us to really appreciate what's happening. And we kind of have an understanding of why things happen. I mean, ultimately it's God's plan, but from a very natural perspective, this has to happen, and so we have to understand why people are willing to do what they're doing in order for Jesus to go to the cross. And so we're going to go through that. We're going to go touch on a little bit of history. Okay, to set the stage, remember that Jesus was first brought to the Jewish establishment. The priests in power wanted Jesus dead. I find this astounding. Here they are. They're supposed to be the protectors of the law, and here's a man, the Son of Man, coming and teaching in the temple, preaching to the masses, and all that the leaders want is him dead. It's just astounding. The priests in power wanted Jesus dead, but they could not kill him. Under Roman authority, they could not do that. Only the Roman authority could do that. So they had to convince the Roman authorities in order for Jesus to actually be killed. And in order to do that, they had to present a very unified front. Under Roman law, the Jews could have a trial and find a criminal guilty, but they could not execute. And so only the Romans could do that with a guilty verdict, and only Pilate could announce that. So at first, he is brought before Annas. And so we're going to just read here. This is the first trial, the first of the religious trials. Okay, so let me just read, and again, right straight from the book. But first, we're going to read scripture, John 18:19-23. So that's John chapter 18:19-23. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. So why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. When he had said this, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus, saying, Is that the way you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, if I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong, but if rightly, why do you strike me? Annas was the real power behind the religious establishment in the days of Christ. For years, he had held the authority of the office of high priest, either personally, through his sons, or through his sons-in-law. And Annas controlled the temple concessions and the corruption those concessions had produced. And we talked about this a couple of sessions ago, where just a few days ago, in terms of what's happening in Scripture, Jesus had gone to the temple and had taken a whip and overturned everything, because the temple leaders, chief priests, and so on were making this ludicrous amount of money off the backs of people trying to purchase items for sacrifice for their sins. So this is what, and so Annas, being the the real authority behind all of that, he's very aware of all of this happening, and he's the one probably reaping the most benefit from it. Okay, so this is what's happening. So Jesus has disgraced the temple leaders because of that, going through the temple with the whip and saying, you have made my Father's house a house of a den of thieves. So now Jesus has been delivered into his hands, and Annas is thrilled with the opportunity to exact revenge on his personal tormentor. Though one of the keepers of the laws of Israel, Annas completely ignores the legal requirements for a just trial, violating at least 4 of the guidelines established for proper legal actions. Number 1, and we'll just touch on them. Number 1, no prisoner could be called on to testify against himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus in John 18:19. It says, so he's asking Jesus, what's your deal? Number 2, no prisoner could be struck while in custody awaiting trial or during the trial itself. But as we read in Scripture, someone reached out and struck Jesus and said, that's not how you talk to the high priest. John 18, verse 22. And no trial, number 3, no trial could be held at night, yet it is deep in the night as they arrive in Annas' house. And number 4, at least 2 days had to expire between the trial and the execution of sentence, but in only a few hours, the innocent Christ will be hanging on a cross. So here we have now, the wheels are in motion, everything is being set, everything's being set up for Jesus to go to the cross. So Annas is the one that he's the first one that Jesus sees, and already the beating has started. He's been struck already, and so then they take him to Caiaphas. Now, Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas. We learned that Annas has complete control. He's kind of head over it all. But if he's not ruling it himself, he does it through his sons. So they're kind of puppets, or through his sons-in-law. And so right now, Caiaphas is in power, is in place. But really, his father-in-law, Annas, is the one that's really, really pulling the strings here. Okay, so step 2, he's standing before Caiaphas. This is the second religious trial, if you will. Okay, so we know that Caiaphas is only a puppet in the hands of Annas. And as such, he doesn't want to lose his position in the temple. So he's not going to go against his own father-in-law. He's not going to say anything or do anything to upset the apple cart. He's enjoying his life of leisure, and he's enjoying his position, and he doesn't want to see that go. The entire family has become wealthy as a result of their greedy misdeeds in the temple. And those without a conscience will do anything to preserve their position and their standard of living. And so, and just to touch on that, we're going to read a little bit about Caiaphas. Here we go. He had no real interest in determining the legitimacy of Christ's claims, yet he was simply trying to solve a problem and remove a growing annoyance. So he doesn't care whether Jesus is telling the truth. He doesn't care if Jesus is innocent or not. He just wants to get rid of it, because he just wants to get rid of Jesus and then get rid of a problem. Then they can continue lining their pockets. In the mind of Caiaphas, the verdict is already predetermined. So he's already kind of maybe been told by Annas that you need to do what you have to do, because this guy needs to go to the cross. He needs to be executed. And so you need to find him guilty. And so we need to kind of do what we have to do in order to make that happen. Caiaphas, well satisfied in having accomplished his goals, calls for a meeting of the Sanhedrin to declare the verdict that has already been decided. So there's already no hope. They've already decided now he just needs to address the Sanhedrin and to convince them that Jesus needs to die. Okay? So that's step 2 of the religious unjust trials. Step 3, and the last of the religious trials, is before the Sanhedrin. So Caiaphas is setting this up now, where he's saying, okay, we need to get the Sanhedrin together, and we need to get this kind of verdict kind of unanimous, and we need to get the wheels really in motion, and we need to get this guy executed and out of the way. So one might think that convincing an entire body of Jewish leaders and believers, and that's what the Sanhedrin is. It's a body that governs the religious establishment of the day. And so back then in Jesus' day, the Sanhedrin for the Jewish people were men that upheld Jewish law and made sure that whatever was happening, whatever current events might be happening, whether it was with the Romans or with their own Jewish people, that they were mindful of it, that they were aware of it, that they dealt with it as per custom and as per the law of the Torah and so on. And also that they, made sure that the Jewish customs, feasts, Passovers, all those kinds of things are well underway and that they are not forgotten. So this is who this is. This is who the Sanhedrin is, that body that governs these kinds of things in Jerusalem. And so one might think that convincing an entire body of Jewish leaders and believers would not be an easy task. In truth, Annas through Caiaphas has to tread carefully. The whole body of the Sanhedrin must agree to send Jesus to the Romans for execution. And so they must work to contrive something that will be convincing. And so in the book it says, the entire pattern of their processes exposes a commitment to corruption. So they're not interested in finding truth. Truth is staring at them in the face, and they're not interested in learning anything about what Jesus is going through or what's happening or anything about him. They just want him gone. Okay? So a couple of points that the book makes that I really just want to point out. They seek false witnesses in order to condemn the one who is the physical embodiment of truth. So again, they're not interested in seeking truth. Here they are, Jesus is standing right in front of them, and they don't care. Secondly, once again, they seek to force Jesus into testifying against himself, this time by taking God's name in an oath. The high priest stood up to him and said, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? Tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." 3, Jesus makes his claim of divine sonship, and he says, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Number 4, Jesus is accused of blasphemy, but there is no attempt made to either prove or disprove the charges, only to condemn him, only to condemn his claims. And last, more illegal beatings and mockery occur, all under the watchful and approving eye of Caiaphas the high priest and the Sanhedrin, the so-called guardians of justice. Then they spat in his face. Matthew 26, verses 67 and 68 says, "Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, 'Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you?' Making a mockery of the Son of Man, the Son of God." And so, so that ends the unjust religious trials. And next time we're going to talk about the civil trials. But I just want to encourage you that we stay humble and very somber and sober during this time, because as Easter kind of rushes toward us, we need to be mindful of what's happening and what had happened during that time and in the time of Christ, of course, for his crucifixion. So I hope that this has encouraged you. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with part 2 with the civil trials. Take care.